Danny Frank for GNAT-TV. I'm very pleased to have Dr. Mariana Budjeryn as my guest on this edition of Danny Frank. Norwich University in upstate Northfield, Vermont, is presenting Dr. Budjeryn with its 2024 William E. Colby Military Writers Award during its October 7th and 8th annual Military Writers Symposium later on this year. And Dr. Budjeryn was chosen for this honor because she recently authored a book called Inheriting the Bomb, The Collapse of the USSR and the Nuclear Disarmament of the Ukraine. It is published by Johns Hopkins Press. And Dr. Budjeryn, I did have the opportunity to read your very comprehensive book about these circumstances, which we're very consumed by even today. And I hope to hit all of the highlights of the book. It's very detailed and very comprehensive, and I could imagine how much research and effort went into publishing this. So let me ask you this. When we look at Russia in 2024, sadly today most Americans don't appreciate the late 1980s into the 1990s, the Soviet Union and how its power structure collapsed, right?
Well, that is very true. These were monumental events, and I think very few people, even experts in the field, even political leaders who were watching this develop, were taken by surprise by the swiftness of the changes in the Soviet Union and its ultimate collapse. One thing that I found through my research and the writing of the book, being originally from Ukraine myself, I was born in what was the Soviet Union back then, in Soviet Ukraine, in its western
Soviet
part.
Union, and Ukraine was a state in the Soviet Union.
It was a republic. They called it a republic within a constituent republic. There were 15 of them within the Soviet Union, and that's exactly the point.
Sort of like in the United States, we have 50 states, and
Indeed.
That was the configuration with the Ukraine and the Soviet Union.
Very similar, except that Ukraine and also Belarus, another constitutive republic of the Soviet Union, were formerly members of the United Nations, founding members since 1945. Now, at that point, from that point on until 1991, when they gained independence, fully fledged independence, their membership mattered very little. But it is to say that these constitutive republics, they had their own parliaments, they had some institutions and structures that were very much subservient to Moscow. But one of the points that I hope the reader takes from my book is that here in the West and in the United States, oftentimes when we think back to the Cold War, when we think back to the Soviet Union, we conflate Russia and the Soviet Union. We use these words here in the United States interchangeably. Russia, Soviet Union, USSR, one and the same thing. It was not. So when the Soviet Union collapsed and all these new states sprung up, Russia was one of the successor states. It was the biggest, of course, it was the most important one, but it was still not the whole of the Soviet Union. And that transition had to take place. That transition had to develop, and questions of succession to the Soviet Union's treaty obligations, statuses under the international law, such as membership in the UN and the UN Security Council, or being a recognized nuclear weapons state under the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the treaty that recognizes only 5 states as nuclear possessors and not any others. All of that had to be negotiated. So part of the story is how Ukraine, but also Belarus and Kazakhstan, 2 other successor states to the Soviet Union in addition to Russia, that inherited parts of the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal, how they negotiated these questions of possession, ownership, entitlement, claims to this nuclear legacy, and at the end of which only one nuclear state emerged, and that was the Russian Federation.
And I must say, through your book, you identify a huge, enormous cast of characters, political characters and leaders in each of these states, and you give title and who they are, and I mean, this was enormous, the amount of people who were all of a sudden displaced, right?
Well, some of the leaders, or the leaders in these newly independent states, like Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan, they were sort of these provincial, as you said, something like state governors or heads of state congresses or houses of representatives. They
making their money off of government, right?
Everything was government in the Soviet Union.
Sure, yeah.
The whole bit. So, but they were rather, they had purview over their local matters in Ukraine or in Belarus and Kazakhstan, and suddenly they became leaders of independent nations. They established diplomatic relations with other states. They had to find the place for their states in the international system, think of who their friends, who their enemies are, who are their allies, and negotiate this very difficult process. So a lot of these people were thrust very quickly onto the world stage, and they were, for the most part, they were quick studies, and I think we have to give them credit as to just how difficult their job was, and that they tried to do the best they thought at the time for their countries. So
during the administrations of George Bush Sr., Bill Clinton, and George Bush Jr., was this a huge historic opportunity that was lost in terms of the way it played out, the way it was handled by the U.S. and managed?
That's a good question. And, I think we have to recognize that it was a very difficult and unpredictable time. So even the wisest leaders did not have a playbook by which to go. They had to navigate and innovate and be entrepreneurial in this situation. So George Bush, the senior, basically was responsible for setting the framework, the main parameters for how the U.S. would handle the Soviet dissolution, including the demand and the expectation on the part of the United States that only one nuclear state, only one nuclear successor should emerge from the Soviet collapse. And Bill Clinton's administration continued in that same line, a policy line. There were unilateral arms control measures. That was unprecedented. Remember, these arms control negotiations, they would drag on for years, all these diplomats coming in and out, Geneva or Vienna, wherever else. It took 9 years to negotiate the Strategic Arms Control Treaty that was signed in '91. And then suddenly, 2 months later, when the Soviet Union starts disintegrating, George Bush Sr. comes out and unilaterally says, we'll withdraw all of the U.S. Nuclear weapons that are deployed overseas, and will, de-alert many of the systems, and so forth, expecting the response from the Soviet side, which did actually come. So these were very unprecedented times. What I think was a missed opportunity is, and I feel a little self-conscious saying that because, of course, my work is on Ukraine, I'm from Ukraine, but I hope I have enough critical distance from this now to say this credibly, is to underappreciate just how crucial and how important Ukraine was to what Russia would ultimately become. And few people recognized it at the time. And one of them was political scientist and former national security advisor for President Carter, Zbigniew Brzezinski. He had argued, he was out of all of these administrations by that time, but he had argued consistently and persistently that without Ukraine, Russia stops being an empire. So Russian imperial ambitions will inevitably turn on Ukraine. And I think there was a lack of appreciation for just how true that was bound to be. So he's one of the people who now could say, I told you so.
Or even recognition of that theory. I mean, you didn't
Right.
really hear that espoused that much, you know.
Right. I mean, we were in a different time, right? It was very optimistic. Suddenly, Russia. So Union was not a
tremendous
threat.
optimism after the Cold War.
There was so much cooperation, even on disarmament. So some of the most secret sites on both sides, like nuclear labs, scientists from the other countries started traveling and going to these sites. That was just difficult to imagine only a few years before. So I think this optimism to think, all right, you know, the Cold War is over, it's all going to be smooth sailing from now on, that has been created blind spots for just how difficult that transition was in the post-Soviet space, kind of the exigencies that it created these very unhealthy economic and political systems. And Ukrainians were trying to shake that system through consecutive revolutions, through trying to keep the power accountable. I'm sure that is something all of people in America can relate to, keeping the powers that be accountable to the people who put them there. That totally does not exist in today's Russia. So that system, political system, took a very different course.
Or even in some of these other states.
And some of the other,
right?
certainly Belarus,
You know,
right? Under the same president now for, 30 odd years.
And I think it's important to point out, while President Reagan got enormous credit for what he did, in terms of helping to bring about the collapse of the Soviet Union in terms of military power and everything. It was really President Bush who actually had to do the heavy lifting early on, right, with a lot of this.
President Bush reacted, but very well and very, I would say, competently.
Bush Sr.
Bush Sr. Right. He did a lot of the reacting because, on the one hand, America did not want to appear as if it's meddling in the internal affairs of the Soviet Union or discrediting any of these pro-independence movements by supporting them, right? But also there were very real fears of instability. On the one hand, there's this arch enemy of the United States that the United States spent billions of dollars over the years trying to, contain, trying to build up military resources and, stop the expansion across the global south and what was then called the Third World. And suddenly it's fraying at the edges and it's falling apart in a way that would have been a celebratory moment, but the dangerous consequences of that was, well, civil war. I mean, if a country like that falls apart with nuclear weapons in the mix, who knows what can happen? And let's remember Yugoslavia.
Yes.
And the wars there, the
Right.
wars of Yugoslavia's dissolution were just coming online
Yes.
in spring 1991. And those would be bloody and those would be ugly. So there was a very real concern to try and keep that process of Soviet dissolution bloodless and stable, if that's at all possible. So managing that change. And I think Bush Sr. deserves a lot of credit for his foreign policy in that regard, even though perhaps some of the Ukrainians might not appreciate how kind of, he took a backseat to this whole, he wasn't, in Ukrainians' view, supportive enough of Ukrainians striving for independence and trying to break free from Moscow.
So with these new emerging states, the new nations, and the end of the Soviet dominance, and the nuclear weapons that were located in these other nations now, that they had inherited, there wasn't really, it was sort of like on the part of the American population, a casual awareness of it. There wasn't an urgency, there wasn't a driving impact. And how did that affect what was going on? That the United States, maybe I'm being simplistic, the population didn't really seem to care. It wasn't a priority for them.
That might have been true. So I don't remember that being a big issue here. I actually spent a year as a high school exchange student at that time in 1991 in New York on Long Island. And of course, it was even far from my awareness at the time, even though I was, from there, from the Soviet Union. I'm not sure how exactly that affected U.S. policy, because a lot of times these kind of nuclear strategic matters, they are decided by a narrow group of people, these defense professionals that are at the Pentagon, a State Department, or the White House, and they, deliberate and make these decisions. My impression was that at the time, and even though this isn't, this is not sort of the scope of my study, but the view from the United States really was that, or popular view, was that of optimism, right? Russians love their children too. Remember the song by Sting? They were not so scary and terrible as we thought they were. And these things of managing the nuclear part of it were left to, the people who handled that for decades.
And we also have to throw into the mix the fact that the populations of these nations, of these states in the Eastern Bloc and in Russia, they were really in large measure not supportive of their government. They were very anti-government. Am I correct? I mean,
so when you say government, you mean the Soviet government?
Yeah.
Right. So
yeah.
The central Soviet government that was still in Moscow, that was presided over by Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev, president, he was really losing his footing and popular support, and there were all these centrifugal forces in the republics. The Baltic states were the first ones to really take a stance, and their parliaments passed these declarations of sovereignty and declarations of independence, and then Georgia too, and then Ukraine and Moldova and Belarus as well. Ironically enough, Russia as well. Russia under President Yeltsin, who's already a president also in Moscow of the Russian Federation that was still part of the Soviet Union with Gorbachev presiding over. There was this power struggle between the two. And in the summer of 1990, that's a full year and a half before the official Soviet dissolution, Russia declares basically independence or sovereignty from the Soviet center. So Russia pulls away. So you got to think, what's left then? There's nothing left to the Soviet Union. So it really was that the power, any kind of power base that Gorbachev had at the time sort of just fizzled away. And at the end, it was just him in his office and all these other leaders that had territory and population and sovereign control over them that were left. And really, the only still central institution left by, say, the fall of 1991, Gorbachev resigned December 25th, 1991, the only institution that was left intact was the Soviet military. It was very centralized, very secretive. The lines of command ran right over the heads of these new national leaders. And the question was, and part of that military was the nuclear forces. And this was a very big question of how to parse it out along these new national lines without causing trouble, without, you have 4 million men under arms in the Soviet Union. 4 million armed men.
Was there ever a time where the Russian military and its power structure that they might have taken over or pierced through the political leadership? That didn't seem to happen at all there, right? I mean,
So if you mean, remember there was a coup in August 1991
Right,
by
right,
the strongmen. A
right.
lot of them were associated with the military and
but
defense
that
complex.
was sort of based on politics, though, right?
Right.
I mean,
but there was, you're
but
right.
the military was
The
behind it.
military was, there were some military leaders that were in collusion with this group. It was over very soon, in 3 or 4 days. And it really is miraculous that nothing worse than that happened. Because, again, there were very different political interests, different national allegiances, and people with arms, lots of arms. So really, we also have to give credit to these new leaders in the independent states that they managed this transition essentially in a peaceful way.
So I consider myself fairly well read, and it just seems that was there ever any consideration, I don't recall, where the U.S. might have taken over these nuclear weapons from these countries that were in chaos at the time and in turmoil? Was there ever a move to do that? I don't recall that ever seeing
There
anything
really
like
hasn't
that
been,
from the Eastern Bloc nations, you know.
because these structures, there were concerns of the so-called loose nukes. So amid kind of these disintegrating structures and you know, loose political supervision, that maybe, you know, people will take them and sell them to Iran or to North Korea or, you know, elsewhere. That was still before Pakistan and India declared themselves as nuclear states, and certainly well before North Korea went nuclear. So there was some demand out there. Through very prudent U.S. policies, but also through the very high morale of these troops associated with nuclear weapons. I mean, they knew what they were handling. They weren't a bunch of crooks, as it turned out. There really hasn't been any such incidents. Now, the United States very quickly passed this program or adopted this program where it appropriated money from the U.S. defense budget as technical assistance to secure and dismantle some of these arms. And it was Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, or also known as a non-Lugar program, after Semnon and Kluger, who were the sponsors of it. It was a bipartisan initiative, and one of the most sort of ingenious Congress-led foreign policy initiatives back in the day, bipartisan. So it really created history then. And that money went to secure these sites because as first Americans who showed up at some of these bases were like, well, security here is basically 3G. Guns, guards, and gulag, right?
Yeah. And there was some opposition in the United States that we were appropriating taxpayer money to do this, right?
Yeah, and sending it to a country that was just recently U.S.'s arch enemy. So there was some foresight there. It was a difficult argument to make, not surprisingly, but in the end, it did a lot of good in those countries and secured nuclear material and help transport nuclear weapons to where they were supposed to be. But really the handling of the nuclear weapons themselves was left to the Russians and to the custodians in these newly independent states. I mean, that's a very secretive part of the United States wouldn't let any other country touch its nuclear weapons, and that was also true for the former Soviet nuclear weapons as well.
So during that period, are we lucky that there wasn't any act of terrorism? Was that a real potential threat that there, with these nuclear weapons, that somebody could have gotten a hold of them? And
Absolutely, there's always that threat. In fact, even under the best of circumstances, there's always that threat. There's a great book, I think it's A Command and Control, maybe. It escapes me now, the author. There's a movie made afterward and after it, and it lists, it discusses all the different incidents that happened here in the United States in a very, quiet circumstances when nothing was disintegrating. crews dropped into missile silo, and then a warhead jets out and does not explode, or a few bombs dropped don't detonate by accident. These accidents exist all the time. And of course, a situation of a disintegration of a nuclear state was very rife with the potential for these kinds of incidents and accidents. So we are lucky, but also this is not to say that people who handled them did so with responsibility. They really were, stepped up to the moment, and we have to be very, very grateful to them that things were handled the way they were.
So Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin, they were somewhat cooperative with the United States and I guess friendly, if you want to cast it that way. But could our government have done more to prevent Vladimir Putin from taking over? Was there an opportunity to prevent that, given what happened with Gorbachev and Yeltsin?
That's a hard question for a historian, because you realize how complex these processes are. There's not one thing you can tweak and then the outcome, happens in the way that you want it to. So also the United States has, justifiably a limited power to change something inside another country. That's up to the people of that country, how they want to develop and where they want to take their country. The United States can shape choices and guide policy that way. I think the biggest missed opportunity, once it became clear really how far someone like Putin was prepared to go, and that became absolutely blatantly clear in 2014 when he moved in, he grabbed a part of Ukraine and Crimea, he started a war in eastern Ukraine.
And he also, the political structure with the legislature in Russia.
He controls it all. There's really no political opposition as such. So once that happened, there should have been a much stronger response. That was a real big missed opportunity. At that point, it was President Barack Obama. He did not want to, create spur escalation. They remembered the leading from behind policy, the pivot to Asia. Russia wasn't really much of a threat anymore, even though it was doing very threatening things right on the borders of the NATO alliance. And, Germany then went ahead in 2015 and signed a multi-billion-dollar pipeline deal with Moscow. So if I were President Putin and I judged what might have been Western reaction to his full-fledged invasion in 2022 from how the West reacted, U.S.-led coalition, how they reacted in 2014, I probably would have done the same thing. Went straight into Ukraine, betting that nobody would even bet an eye.
Dr. Budjeryn, in our remaining minute, I'd like you to tell our viewers about some of your distinguished career roles that you've had.
Well, I don't really have a very distinguished career role. I started my graduate studies, my master's and PhD, rather late in my life, actually. I already had 3 kids, and I was, a mother bringing them up, and I went back to school and juggled all that, and ended up winning a fellowship at Harvard to turn my dissertation into a book. It took me way longer than I thought it would, but in the end, I was able to stay there at the Harvard Kennedy School at the Belfer Center as a staff researcher. I put out this book. It's my 4th baby. It's out in the world, and I'm now working on my next research project, which is about Russian takeover and occupation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the biggest one in Europe that is currently under Russian control.
We've been talking with Dr. Mariana Budjeryn. I recommend that you read her book. Thank you very much for being our guest on Danny Frank.
Thank you so much for inviting me.